Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of the James Madison program at Princeton University. My name is Laura Laurent, and in this episode, we speak with Dr. Grahm McAleer and Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Publu, who are co-authors of the book titled The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism and the Western Tradition, which offers a renewed vision of conservatism for the 21st century. They take inspiration from the late Roger Scruton and begin with a simple question. What, after all, is the meaning of conservatism? In our conversation, we discuss conservative humanism, the extension of humanism through time, and its interactions with other systems of thinking, particularly with its engagement with natural law. We take inspiration from their rich and mutual backgrounds in medieval philosophy, and they show us threads which they believe outline a succinct and sustaining conservatism. So please join me to welcome Dr. Grahm McAleer and Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Publu to Madison's Notes. Hello and welcome, Dr. Grahm McAleer and Dr. Rosenthal-Publu. It is wonderful to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much. An honor to be here.
Thanks very much for having us.
Wonderful. So, Dr. McAleer, could you start with giving us just a brief introduction to who you are, also to let our listeners know what your voice sounds like, since they don't have the pleasure of looking at you right now as I do?
So I'm a professor of philosophy at Loyola University, Maryland, and I've been there for about 30 years. Loved it, actually. It's been great.
And Dr. Rosenthal, how about you?
So I was teaching at Johns Hopkins University at the government program. I have a doctorate in philosophy, and I was teaching for about 16 years. And I'm currently the director of the Petrarch Center, which does sort of private courses in classical learning and intellectual history and that sort of thing. So.
Wonderful. Well, we're really excited to have you on the show today, and specifically to unpack some of the contents of your book that came out within the last year, titled The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism and the Western Tradition. Now, you two co-authored this book together, and something I find very interesting, both in academic and non-academic settings, is this type of collaborative production and creation. Can you give me a little bit more insight into where your friendship was formed and out of what experiences came the ideas and inspiration for this book?
Well, maybe I'll start with sort of the origin story, and then maybe Alex will say something about the origin story of the actual book itself, right? So the origin story of Alex and I. So the book is dedicated to a professor we both had at the University of Leuven in Belgium. We both began in medieval philosophy, and we worked with this professor who very sadly died at a very young age. And the reason how we know each other is through the Catholic University of Leuven, the Philosophy Institute there in Belgium. And when we met, we hit it off. We had an interest both in the Middle Ages, but also in the sort of continuing relevance of the ancient and medieval traditions in the Enlightenment, or in trying to understand, you might say, our postmodern condition, or whatever you want to say. But we always, one reason we bonded, right, was because we just had this long perspective on the development of the history of ideas and their continued resilience.
As far as the book itself, so 2020 was an interesting year in a number of respects. I think not just for us, but for many people. If you recall, it was the COVID lockdown period. Sir Roger Scruton, who may be the most significant intellectual conservative philosopher, had just recently passed away, and so we were thinking about, I think, the zeitgeist of the time as far as what will become of traditionalist conservatism, or what will become of conservatism. And I think there were two, to my mind at least, there are two big issues that 2020 raised. One was Scruton's idea of the culture of repudiation that I think was on full display in 2020. If you recall the wave of iconoclasm, where statues of the founding fathers and Churchill and Columbus and all these traditional heroes of the West were attacked, it very much reflected, I think, Scruton's idea that there's a problem with the West, which contemporary West, which is this idea of repudiating our traditions, right? Repudiating our ancestral traditions. And the other thing I think that was going on is that conservatism was in a bit of I would say, still in a bit of an identity crisis, right? What is conservatism in the 21st century? Roger Scruton had written about it in the 1980s, right? And that was in the context of a very different world, the world of the Cold War and so forth. And I think that one of the things that has happened is that the consensus over what conservatism is has broken down. You see that today, for example, in the clash between what we could call liberal conservatism and national conservatism, right? Freedom conservatives and national conservatives. So one of the things that I think we were thinking about is there, without necessarily critiquing radically other systems, but just what is conservatism? Is there something about conservatism which is not reducible either to liberalism or to nationalism, which seemed to be somewhat of the way things were going as of, I think it's continuing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and presumably you had moved on both from Belgium, and 2020 was a time of virtual connections, perhaps. What was who instigated the proposition of saying, hey, let's write a book about this? What was that process like for you two?
Well, I think the original idea was Alex's. You might correct me on that, but I'm pretty sure it was Alex who had some chapters that would be really useful for a foundation for a book. And Alex and I would say are a little different in that Alex is very interested in the sort of the ancient world in particular. We share the interest in the Middle Ages together, and I'm especially interested in the sort of Enlightenment, postmodernism. So we quickly saw that we could sort of sketch out kind of a long history of the sort of idea of the West and our commitment to the West, so that we would complement one another quite well. But we, of course, both knew, I know about the ancients as well, right? And Alex certainly knows about the moderns as well. So, it wasn't a case of sort of two different books kind of bolted together. It was a very organic process. We each sort of thought about what would be the core elements for a kind of an ancestral conservatism. And then we sort of wrote those chapters and then kind of exchanged the chapters backwards and forwards. And so we were sort of constantly sort of writing and rewriting the chapters through a kind of online meeting. I forget how often we met, but we were meeting quite regularly and to talk about the ideas and then to sort of edit one another's work. I don't, Alex, maybe do you remember it that way?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I don't remember exactly. What I kind of remember is I was working on this question of the quiddity of conservatism, or the essence of conservatism, and then we started discussing the fact that, with Scruton's death, like where, there's a bit of a sense of a kind of loss of direction, like we could really use a book now. and I don't know who suggested the collaboration first, but I think it happened very organically. And I think he's exactly right about our complementary interests, right? So we certainly have a lot of crossover in our interest in the Middle Ages and the Catholic tradition of Catholic social thought. I have like a very deep interest in the Greco-Roman world, as well as like Renaissance humanism, that sort of thing. And Graham has a great interest in the Scottish Enlightenment and contemporary continental philosophy. So if you want to write a long, cover a lot of ground in terms of the history of the West, we had very complementary interests.
Yeah, two brothers from the same the same timeline, but two ends of the spectrum, which is very, very cool that you could overlap in the middle like that. Dr. Rosenthal-Publu, speaking of conservatism and the somewhat identity crisis that the conservative movement is maybe going through at the moment, where is that coming from particularly? What is the instigating forces behind that, and how is the text of a humanist conservatism differentiating from other interpretations of conservatism at this moment?
Yeah, two very good questions, right? So why is the identity crisis happening now? Well, for one thing, I think to some degree, the question of conservatism during the Reagan era, let's say, or during the Cold War era, was clarified by the opponent of communism, right? So groups that might not have very obvious intellectual coherence, let's say libertarians and religious traditionalists, were united by the factor of the what Sallust called the metus hostilis, the enemy, helped to create what's called fusionism, right? As being really this mixture of classical liberalism and sort of religious and cultural traditionalism that brought those groups together. A number of things I think have happened. Um, as a result, for example, of questions raised about globalization and its impact, for example, on the working class, as well as on cultural identities. You've seen a nationalist backlash, right, across the United States and Europe and other places, which is quite questioning of some of the premises of classical liberalism, liberal individualism, for example. Viktor Orban is pretty open about this sort of thing, about critique of liberal individualism and globalization and this. So that's what I think is happening now. What I would say is, in terms of humanism, right? So if we understand conservatism as we do in the traditional sense, which is the defense of the tradition, what is the Western tradition, right? And then one has to look at what is it that makes the Western tradition distinct? What is what we call the master idea that runs through the whole thing, right? That we can use to explain the narrative of the West. And the idea that comes to mind is humanism, right? So it's possible to look at the history of the Western heritage and in terms of each distinctive age, how it treated the theme of humanism. So we can talk about a classical humanism, a Christian humanism, and a distinctly modern.
Okay. I'm curious, in the chapter on conservatism in the book, you give sort of a trinity of the conservative practice, which is, it was family, religion, and education. And can you expand more on perhaps our traditional understanding of those systems versus how we're seeing them play out now, and your argument for why they are still so potent and important in this particular thought framework?
Sure. So if we think of conservatism as about conserving, right, then you have to think of what are the fundamental institutions or organs by which traditions of a culture are conserved, right? How is it that what comes to us from the past is guarded in the present and passed on to future generations? And conservatives over and over again, this is not an a priori theory. If you just look at conservative authors, they over and over again turn to these three themes, right? So religion, as Christopher Dawson wrote, is in some sense the key to world history, right? If you look at the great civilizations of the world, whether it's Christianity in Europe or Islam in the Middle East or Hinduism in India or whatever it is, as he would say, probably culture and cult are related, right? So religion has had this all-embracing sort of civilizational force as a foundation for moral values, art, education. There's virtually nothing in a society which is not influenced by its religion. Family, clearly, even on just a physical level, right? Societies reproduce themselves through marriage and family and procreation, right? So concern for the family, right? We hear all the time, even today, right? Family values and these sorts of things is fundamental. And then education, right? I mean, some education happens in the family, which is sometimes called the first school of life, right? I mean, it's a kind of enculturation, but every civilization has its own educational tradition, which is sort of reproduces the intellectual form or mind of the culture generation after generation, right? I mean, it's not exclusive to the West. Think of the Confucianism in China that lasted for thousands of years. The tradition of liberal arts, which goes back to the Greeks and Romans, has been a very continuous force in Western culture, and a very fertile force that has furnished the foundation for a lot of its achievements, right? If you think of philosophy and literature and science and all these things, many of them grow out of people formed in this Western liberal arts tradition with its classical origins.
Yeah, it seems to me that those components, family, religion, education, are somewhat basic building blocks of the human life, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to a spiritual force of some kind, God, and then our relationship to our community or family. And so regardless of what one is trying to preserve, those would be where it's preserved. And like I get my family's, and I'm curious as far as this humanistic aspect, can we drill into conservatism without humanism? Can you have conservatism without humanism? What does that look like? And what are the impacts of pulling humanism through conservatism and emphasizing this particular thread in it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So one of the reviews of the book actually pointed out, like, wait a minute, you say that humanism is the master idea of the West. Why not natural law? Right. So that was very interesting, right? That was somebody at the Federal Society, I think, who made that argument. And so, yeah, you probably could maybe think about other overarching um, sort of themes pulling the West together. But I think the humanist idea is important because one of the great inheritances from the ancients, and to a degree the Middle Ages as well, is this idea of the cultivation of the person. And the story we sort of tell is that the ancients sort of started that, but that it gets a significant boost in Christianity, right? So you just think about ideas of like Christian personalism, for example, in the modern Catholic Church. But even on the sort of liberal, secular, right, this idea of privacy, the idea of a personal space, the idea of a personal sense of style, right? So one of the things about the humanist tradition is that it puts front and center the idea of the person. Now, what we tried to do in the book, of course, was balance the idea of the person with the idea of rule of law, right? So this idea that, so we have a chapter on law and we have a chapter on natural law. So we sort of totally concede the point that was made in one of the reviews about the importance of the natural law tradition. But I think it's quite important that I say this, right? One of the typical criticisms of the natural law tradition is that it is too constricting, it's too narrow, it's parochial. And I don't think that's a very accurate summary of the natural law, but it's certainly a common one that you find. For example, you'd find it amongst a lot of law professors, for example, right? And if you just walked into a law school in America and said, hey, what do you think about natural law? They would say, yeah, it's bad. Because it's parochial, it's restrictive, it's and so we wanted to because we wanted to tell a broad story about the Western tradition. We wanted to take very seriously the things that liberals, and just by that we mean a kind of um, secular, maybe kind of represented by maybe somebody like Fukuyama, would totally recognize and feel sympathy with, and would expect to take seriously, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't think conservatism would be very viable if it really couldn't speak to the sense of contemporary individuality, singularity, these issues of privacy.
Another thing that comes to mind, if you take the humanism out of conservatism, there's the question of, well, why preserve tradition, right? Like, what is the value of tradition? There can be traditions that are horrible, right? This was one of the questions that came up, in that you can have traditions of gladiator games, and slavery was a tradition, and all kinds of horrible things, right? What was it that ultimately undid slavery in the West? It was this view of the value of the human person, right, as an overarching value. The politics of the right, as we know, can go into some dark places as well, right? in terms of extreme xenophobia, to give one example, right? Or ultra-nationalism, right? There are extremes that are dangerous, morally dangerous. What is the break on that? I think this idea of, well, I would say the Christian idea of the infinite value of the human person is a break on any kind of racialism or xenophobia to which the politics of the extreme right has sometimes been vulnerable. And I would say also the Greco-Roman idea of the cultivation of human excellence is something of enduring and universal value.
Well, yeah, actually, just on the back of that, I mean, it goes to one of your earlier questions about, what is the crisis, within conservatism, right? Because one of the big options is, of course, some sort of ethno-nationalism, right? So we spent quite a bit of time on this Russian thinker, Dugin, who is sort of talking about the polycentric world, right? And that's become huge, right? So we now routinely talk about a multipolar world. And so, we do have the rise of civilizational states. That's maybe one way you could describe contemporary India, contemporary China, contemporary Russia, right? Are these sort of civilizational states, which sits a little uncomfortably with the Western sort of liberal idea, right? So one thing we wanted to be very alert to was this idea that there is, as Alex puts it, right, certain conservative thinking can go into dark places, right? That you don't want to end up in, or at least we don't want to end up in some sort of ethno state, right? Because, as pointed out, in fact, by David Hume, that ethno states, and here he meant, of course, the old city republics, tended to be super intolerant places because any divergence from the core identity of the city republic was a threat to its endurance. And so Hume in the 18th century, when people are talking about the return to the ancient republic model, is like, no, this is completely incompatible with tolerance. And so we thought that one of the contemporary drives in amongst the right to a sort of national conservatism, to an ethno-conservatism, as you find in Dugin, would sort of go against what we think is one of the great legacies of the West, right? This valorization of the person.
I'm curious about this more present day interpretation of humanism and how humanism, apart from humanism and conservatism, aren't always paired together as you have put them. And so there's many other interpretations of humanism in the present day, and you particularly discuss Heidegger a significant amount in one of your chapters, which I have some background in, but not extensively, but particularly in metaphysics and humanism. Like, how is humanism metaphysically presented in the present day, and what does that mean for the culture that we're seeing unrolled today?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question. One of the things we discussed was humanism and the Enlightenment, right? Because I think when you just use the term humanism, you have in mind secular humanism very often, right? I mean, if somebody says I'm not religious, I'm a humanist, right? Many that's in the common currency of the culture. The Enlightenment, like all epochs, has its complexity, and there's a lot about the Enlightenment that we affirmed as positive. Its promotion of rights and tolerance and things like that. But the Enlightenment also brought into being this sort of secular humanism that we view, looking at thinkers like Berdyaev, among others, as ultimately contradictory, because it's very difficult to build the belief in the exceptional or unique value of the human being on the basis of materialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if your view of the world is that humans are, as Yuval Harari put it, right? Humans are just one more insignificant animal, basically, right? That just happened to come together in the right way from the cosmic soup. It's very difficult to give any sort of transcendental value to the human person. So the thing is that in one sense, the secularizing trends that begin in the Enlightenment and are unfolding in our time very, very strongly, right, with the trend towards secularization, a big problem with it is that it ultimately undermines humanism. And I think that that's why we're at the cusp of a moment where we're talking about post-humanism, right? more and more people talk, are machines going to replace human beings? Are we going to crack the human genome and start producing human beings like commodities? There's all these questions that are raised by technology, which actually was one of Heidegger's big themes. Not that we don't have our own critiques of Heidegger, but the point is that that's where I think we are. We're at the moment at which this secular humanism begins to undermine humanism.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up on that, right? Because it's a really interesting theme. I mean, one thing you might say is that, or at least our position would be, right, that conservatism, one thing it's seeking to conserve is human dignity. And one of the things about human dignity is that we would think of it, I think, the lived experience, right, or the phenomenology of human dignity is something like discretion, that we are expected to be, as it were, discreet around one another, right? We are not to be overly invasive of one another, right? So the problem with something like a ethno-conservatism, or maybe even a national conservatism, is that there is too much presumption, there is too much expectation, that the that one's sort of personal flair, style, whatever, right, would be sort of just in conformity with the community. So I think that the problem with something like secular humanism, that it and indeed, as Alex points out, right, sort of the post-humanist moment absolutely undercuts something like a sense of integrity, a sense of dignity, a sense that each person has a sort of special vantage point on the world, and that there's supposed to be some sort of discretion about that, right? That we are not to be overly prying and things like that, right? So I think that that's just sort of built into the meaning of a dignity for human persons.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, is this desire to avoid prying and an ability to preserve an individual's ability to express and experience the world, is it control of that individual's expression and experience, or is it more about actually witnessing it in the ethno state that we want to avoid?
Yes, well, I mean, one interesting thing that you're touching on, I think, is think about if we were just to sort of say, look, right now, what's one of the crisis points in the West? I think what we would think of is, right, the problem of free speech, the idea that that dissent, which was once so celebrated in the West, right, in the 60s and the 70s, everything was about dissent, right, but dissent now seems to be highly controlled, both at universities, on the web, in taking up political positions, which could be, I mean, are at least sort of debatable positions, right? So think about those, you know, like maybe like a good figure here, right, would be John Mearsheimer, right? So just think about, who I actually don't know if he's a conservative or not, right? But let's just think about his position on the Russia-Ukraine war. No, I mean, he's a very eminent thinker, and everyone acknowledges that he's an eminent thinker, but he's been very, very clear about how much pressure he's under, right? He's a Putin stooge. And his point is that, look, great leaders make strategic decisions. So whatever you think about that, right, the point is, right, that there's just this sort of enormous pressure of conformity that cuts against something that we all thought was one of the great inheritances of the Western tradition, right, which was this sort of personal discretion, personal autonomy, a drive to sort of self-cultivation, right? This would be a sort of really important point, right, from the ancients onwards. And yet we find enormous pressure on that. And that's not totally different than the kind of pressures that Hume warned about the return to a kind of a republican ideal of the city-state, or indeed, right, ethno-conservatism today.
Since your relationship both meets in the middle of medieval philosophy, I'm curious, what does Aquinas bring to this conversation? Because I have been around so many Aquinas scholars, and you speak of him extensively in your chapters, but as someone who hasn't the same context of the period, can you tell me more about how his ideas and his philosophy intertwines with what you're presenting?
I think of Aquinas as sort of the figure who most enshrines the meeting of so-called Athens and Jerusalem in some respect, right? So
Mm,
this was the period in which the Roman Catholic Church was confronted with the translations of Aristotle, right, and this sort of integral philosophical tradition, and the question was how to bring them together, which is what I think the Thomistic thesis is fundamentally about. And I think he's also a kind of humanist figure in the sense that he has this confidence in human reason and in human powers to understand the world, so that really the church need not fear philosophy and reason. Right? He has the theory of the two truths. Right? The supernatural light of faith and the natural light of reason, and he saw these two as very much in harmony. So I would think he's very important to any narrative of the West if we understand the West as the meeting of the Greco-Roman tradition and the Judeo-Christian traditions, right?
Yeah, and there's another way to put that as well, right? Which is on the one hand, and I think that maybe this is where you're coming from, James Madison, right? You've got the whole sort of philosophy of law aspect of Aquinas. And, Aquinas' treatment of law is really very beautiful, right? So on the one hand, the law is sort of coextensive with the cosmos, right? Because of the central figure of Christ. But Aquinas is also super sensitive to all the different varieties of law that there are, right? So on the one hand, you've got natural law, you've got civil law, you've got church law, you've got customary law that comes out of the life of the populace. And so his theory of law wants to sort of corral these different strains of rule of law. And we think that that's an extremely attractive position. But then the other aspect of Aquinas, of course, and then both a sort of positive and a negative, is you've got his treatment of the ancient tradition, which Alex was just talking about, in his virtue theory, right? So this idea that persons cultivate themselves through the virtues. And then what does Aquinas sort of add to that from the explicit Christian tradition? Well, you've also got the problem of the deadly sins, right? So it's not only are we able to sort of cultivate this high personal sort of civilized propriety, discreet life for ourselves through the virtues, but Aquinas also alerts us to these really sort of subversive dynamics in the human spirit as well, right? Problems of gluttony, vanity, lust, right? So he's got this super sophisticated rule of law on the one hand and moral psychology on the other. And put those two things together, and we think you've got a very powerful uh, account of human dignity.
mm. I'm curious, pushing into this point on law, what do you see is the general conservative interpretation of law and their relationship to it? And that is both natural law, that's civic law, that's religious law, because oftentimes I think I can see them getting entangled, and it doesn't have such a clear distinguishing nature as Aquinas maybe outlines. And so, how do you see that at our present state? And then, what would you encourage individuals positioned towards different types of law to be?
Well, one of the things I think is most important about Aquinas and the Thomistic theory of law is his idea that there is a law above the human law, right? But not one, but not, and that's, but I mean, on the one hand, we can talk about theocratic laws, right, like divine law, but he thinks that it's something that's accessible to humans as human. And there's Aquinas's humanism, and that's the natural law. And why is that? Why is it important to imagine that there are universal and immutable principles of natural law that provide a standard for our civil laws? Well, because without that, look at Martin Luther King, who cited Aquinas in the letter on a Birmingham jail, right? I mean, You had segregation laws, that was the law. But Aquinas would say that kind of law is just an act of force by the state. So how do you go about judging the positive law if you don't have another standard? So this is where I think Aquinas is very important. And Martin Luther King also refers to the Nuremberg laws, right, which also against Jews and others in Nazi Germany, right? So that there's also, you can have horrific law, right? And what standard of justice are you going to use to judge that? In contemporary society, it's not unlikely to be some sort of theocratic law, but the appeal to natural law is something that conservatives can make to human beings as such by appealing to their reason, which is not, by the way, to deny the importance of biblical principles and things like that. But there's also, what do you do with people who don't believe in the Bible? Well, we can still meet on the ground of natural law, presumably, right? If it's founded in reason and human nature.
Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting points there, right? Because, of course, what Aquinas says about the natural law is that it's rational, right? So this would be, I think, an important thing that Alex and I would want to insist on. And this maybe goes back to your Heidegger point, that we want to insist on the Western tradition as part of this cultivation of the self, with the virtues, with the use of reason. And one of the things about sort of Heidegger is that he's a challenge to that, right? We have a chapter on the metaphysics of conservatism where we look at Heidegger's idea of sort of history as the encounter with risk, this sort of almost wagering it all in this sort of heroic encounter with whatever history throws at you, right? And we think this can spiral in really shocking ways. And so we definitely want to hold on to the conservative tradition as a meditation on the role of rationality in public life. And that then maybe goes back in an interesting way to where we started talking about Scruton. Because what's interesting about Scruton's really brilliant book, I mean, the book that kind of launched our project, right, The Meaning of Conservatism, is that Scruton was not much of an advocate for natural law. He was very much part of the common law tradition, this idea that the English had a historical tradition, and that this historical tradition had a legitimacy to it, that the English peoples broadly understood, American, Kiwis, right, Aussies, right, they'd all sort of, South Africans to a degree, and Indians to a degree had sort of subscribed to this sort of broader common law tradition. And I mean, that's a very respectable position, obviously, inside of conservatism. But because I think Alex and I think that one of the possible crises within conservatism is the push coming from this sort of polocentric, ethnocentric, hard right conservative position, right, that then kind of feeds into a milder version of national conservatism, right, but which is still sort of potentially this idea that national histories determine fundamentally how we treat persons. We wanted to definitely push back against that, right? We wanted to adopt this sort of natural law position, which I think delivers a certain kind of universality to human dignity that just Alex and I think is sort of a critical part of the Western legacy, right? And this is why, right, there was this long criticism, like, hey, why not just make natural law the underlying idea? It's because, of course, we think the natural law aspect is part of the humanistic tradition. But the intuition's a good intuition, right? That unless you've got some sort of universal standard, which we would think of as rational natural law, you're at least opening the door to this more sort of Heideggerian, high risk, polycentric, the sort of say the nativist gods, right? And you're back in we think, a pretty potentially scary world.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fundamental problems I think with a concept like Dugin's, who I think uh, uh, is really rooted in sort of the romantic critique of all universalisms, right? That's what Heidegger also. There's kind of an archaism in that strain of German thought. I think Dugin has it also. Is this you end up with a kind of cultural relativism, right? Which a certain kind of conservatism is vulnerable to because it reveres tradition and rightly so, right? But there are traditions that are horrible and that need to be judged, right? If you have a tradition of human sacrifice, or you have a tradition of keeping certain ethnic groups in a caste system, and subordinate them within a caste system or something like that, that there needs to be some basis for that to be critiqued. So on the one hand, conservatism, I think, has a kind of inherent is more open to particularism and particular culture than you say traditional, like say a Kantian cosmopolitanism or something like that, which tends to more or less try to erase or play down all distinctions among human beings. But you want to kind of via media, right? Custom and tradition, the kind of things that Scruton is talking about, as Graham was elucidating, have an important place, right? Each people, what's right for Britain may not be right for France, and so forth, right? Or Japan, and so forth, right? There's a place for custom and culture and so forth, but there's also an important need for these foundations and universal moral principles that reason can discern.
I'm curious about reprimitivism and your discussion of Francis Fukuyama, in that it was unclear to me exactly what you meant by reprimitivism. So can you please clarify the role of reprimitivism in your argument, and particularly how Francis Fukuyama is tied in with that?
Yeah, so I mean, there are strains or stresses on the West today, right? Um, and one of those is the uh, fascination, and I think you see this in the conservative Alexander Dugin from Russia, with the return to the ancestral gods, right? The return to push back beyond the historical legacy. So for Alex and I, right, we are happy to be heirs of an historical legacy from the ancients through the medievals through the Enlightenment, right? We want to find a kind of a story of continuity. But there is a pressure within the right to kind of jettison that, right? To really push back down into this sort of primordial, polycentric, ancestral world of the sort of the old gods, right?
Mm.
Um, so that's one aspect of a reprimitivism.
Mm.
And then you're going to find that, in the new right. But there's another sense of reprimitivism, which is a problem that you might say the problem of the Enlightenment state, which is that the Enlightenment is in a kind of a twilight, right? The Enlightenment state is disaggregating, and this is Fukuyama's point. So Fukuyama, who is an important part of the book, right? We admire his great classic work, right, on the end of history. We sort of disagree with it, but we acknowledge it's a great work, and it defined more or less Western consciousness from the end of the Cold War until more or less, you might say, 2020, COVID, right? This was what was called the unipolar moment. But now, very quickly, if we just think of 2020 as a watershed, very quickly, we're now in the multipolar moment, right? Because Russia's asserting itself, China's asserting itself, India's asserting itself. And there's a sense that the West has deep-seated problems, right? So it's just routine. It's absolutely routine that you'll hear somebody say, wow, uh, I was just I flew out of Singapore's airport and I just got into JFK and I felt that I'd stepped back in time, right? There's this sense, right, in
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
there's something kind of creaky and kind of a little bit obsolete about the West,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Fukuyama, in his later work, he starts to talk about this problem, the disaggregating Western state, which of course became the model for state power globally. Right, the globalization model that Fukuyama sort of made so famous, the Western bureaucratic liberal state was to be the model of all state power. But that model has started to really struggle. And in many parts of the globe, you don't have anything remotely like that. So what you're going to have, right, if the state starts to wither, then you're definitely going to have something like a reprimitivism, right? You're going to have various kinds of political demons released, ethnic demons released, right? Because there was something quite good about what Fukuyama was talking about, right? There's something really good about bureaucratic states. You know, we had those in the ancient Romans, we had those in the Middle Ages. You know, the idea of a kind of a rational bureaucratic state is not a bad thing. And that's what we meant. You know, we wrote this chapter on establishment, right? Where certain establishment, things like the diplomatic service, the officer corps, the great universities, schools, churches, right? These are all things that bear within them values that affirm the importance of human dignity. But if that starts to erode, then other forces are going to be released. So, for example, in the modern economy, where you have failing bureaucratic state, what very frequently takes their place is organized crime. So there are many parts of the globe where actually who's in charge? Organized crime.
Mm-hmm. And they're also usually advertising themselves as giving some sort of structural value to the community as well.
Right. Well, and of course, in a sense, they do. Right. Because I mean, if you don't have a reliable state, or you've got a corrupt state, or you've got a disaggregating state, then the local cartel, which seems to have at least some organizational structure, and seems to have some way of kind of keeping the absolute worst kinds of people in control, right? This is a weird thing, right? That the cartels might not be the absolute worst thing out there. So people tend to move towards them, or they move towards sort of autonomous self-defense organizations, right? Which is a very common phenomenon. In the world, or vigilante justice, right? So we've seen some really graphic examples of that recently in Brazil, right? So even a country like Brazil, you know, probably the seventh largest economy in the world, is a disaggregated state. I mean, it's not what we might think of here in the United States, where the federal government's kind of always in charge. It's okay, right? And so you see, right, things like lynch mobs. Now, some of these, somebody might say, "Oh, very ancestral," that right? There's always been this kind of domestic justice that's happened, right? But this then gets us back to our point. Well, no, right? Yeah, you definitely want a kind of an affirmation of the particular loyalties of communities, but you also want this universal kind of umbrella, which we argued in the book, right? That is actually sort of the structure of the natural law itself, right? The natural law sort of begins with particular loyalties and then opens out onto broader loyalties. So that's what we meant by reprimitivism, that what we need is a conservatism that's not saccharine. I mean, I do think you can find that a little bit on the right, a rather sanitized version of politics. We wanted to sort of have a conservatism that really spoke to the constant pressures on public order. And so another thing that we added, and then I'll stop and I'll throw it over to Alex. Another thing we added was actually the pressure even internal to the human being. Right. So this is why we kind of end with psychoanalysis, right? But you can go back to Aquinas on the deadly sins, right? Yes, human persons have tremendous capacity for dignity, but we are fragile beings. We can quickly revert to extraordinarily unpleasant creatures. So reprimitivism can happen within persons, it can happen within states, it can happen within a civilization. So that's why we just wanted to kind of not close the book, that's not the end of the book, it's the last chapter, before we have a pretty lengthy conclusion. But we wanted to just close with this idea, well, to what degree does conservatism have a resilience if we take super seriously both internal pressures on persons and internal and external pressures on states?
On the reprimitivism issue, one of the things I think about is you mentioned Heidegger, and you could think also about things, figures like Nietzsche. A lot of what they did was this glorification of the archaic Greece, right? So Socrates, by bringing reason and virtue and putting the focus there on the ethical question, is for them kind of the fall of the Greeks, and they want to go back to this archaic idea. And there's this kind of vitalism, like a glorification of health and instinct and animal vigor and this sort of thing that you find in this strain, which turned out to be a quite dangerous. The other thing I wanted to say about the state is another theme in our book, and I think it's a theme of conservatism generally. You go back to the beginning, we talked about religion, family, and education. All of those refer to what we might call intermediary institutions, right? Institutions between the state and the individual. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the debate today is framed between, on the one hand, the advocates of the state, right? And there have been traditional ones like socialists, fascists, and others who believe in a very, very expansive state. And then you have those who say, no, that threatens the liberty of the individual. Both totalitarianism and anarchy are obviously extremes, but what I think the conservative would emphasize is these intermediary institutions, which are communal but not statist, right? The family, the church, private educational institutions, and I think the American founding fathers also understood. For example, if you read people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton on the importance of the inculcation of the virtues through institutions like religion and so forth for a free society, right? In other words, if people can't control themselves, they're going to need to be controlled by an ever more powerful state. So if you want freedom in the liberal sense, which tends to be more of a negative freedom sense of non-interference by the state, you're going to have to cultivate freedom in the positive sense that the ancient Greeks would talk about, the freedom of self-mastery, right? So I think those are important. Those are also important themes of the intermediary institutions between the state and the individual, and also the understanding of liberty, that basically both of the great understandings of liberty in the Western tradition, both this idea that the individual should have a certain space of autonomy from the interference of others and of the state, but also the sense of freedom as self-mastery, virtuous self-mastery that comes from the classical tradition and was emphasized also by the Christian tradition.
As we begin to wrap up here, what were some of your perhaps earlier experiences as a young person that have informed your not only career, but your thought life and how you've progressed to where you are today? I find the development of the human person very interesting, and particularly in regards to what you are choosing to practice in your life now. What were some of the formative experiences that brought you to your practice of life today?
I'll go, and can I make it sort of anecdotal? Is that okay?
Please.
So it's very interesting. So I've lived in America for 30 years, but I'm not a citizen. And I had a very interesting. I've always really loved coming back into America, and you go through passport control, and the passport officer often says, "Welcome home." And I've always loved that, right? And because although I go back to England a good deal, and America is certainly my home. I have 3 daughters; they're thoroughly American. They all live here in America, even though they've got British passports. When they graduated college, they chose to stay in America. But I'm not a citizen. And I had a very interesting. One of the passport control officers said, "You've been here a long time, looking at your file, right, going through passport control. You've been here a long time. You should become a citizen." And I was like, "Whoa, hey! I thought I was going to get the welcome home speech, right?" But actually, I've thought about this question for quite a long time. And the thing is, I'm a monarchist, and so although of course there's nothing prohibiting me from both being a citizen of America and a subject in England, That's just very important to me, is this idea of the British establishment rooted in a monarchy and all that flows from that in terms of the diplomatic corps, the officer corps, courts, the universities, right? So so one reason I'm a conservative is that I am, I think, very wedded to the idea of monarchy. And if I may be just a final anecdotal, this actually, I came from a lower middle class, but there's been a very strong, historically very strong working class support of the monarchy in England. And I think you see this when the English monarchs go around towns and all that, right? That's not the aristocracy coming out to cheer, right? It's the rank and file British person, right? And so, my family were always very monarchy centric, right? As I think, most kind of working class and lower middle class people are to this day. And so these things stay with you, don't they? So I think that. And then you have these sort of sentiments, right? And then, of course, right, once a college professor or whatever, you start thinking about, well, wait a moment, what are the sort of the big ideas that sustain that? And are they worthwhile ideas? And I think they are.
That answer fed two birds with one scone, because I wanted to ask you how your context as a Brit informed this. So I got both answers. Thank you. But yeah, Dr. Rosenthal-Publu, please tell us what your experience has been like.
Well, it's a complex question, but I think one of the things about my mother's family's from Spain. We had three generations in my household, right? So my grandmother, my mother, and of course us lived with us, and of course my dad and so forth, right? So that's one thing. One is the American European, right? So I had like a Spanish mother and an American New York father. So that's one thing. So it made me very interested in sort of the broad tradition of the West, right? More generally. But I think with my grandmother, like she would tell me all these stories when I was a kid about life in the early 20th century. She remembered World War I. She was born in 1906, right? And the world that she described was so radically different, right? Spain at that time was a world of nobility and monarchs, and that had actual, Europe in when she was born. You had actual monarchies with actual power and so forth. So it made me, all the stories that she would tell me, and she was very, it was all the stories that she would tell me about the family and different, she knew the family history going back a long time. So it made me very interested in history, because one sees just how radically different in one century the world of 1906 and the world of 1996 is. And she happened to be a quite intellectual woman. Another thing would be, my brother was a philosophy major, and he had this vast library of philosophy books, right? So when I was a kid, I would just pick them up and start reading them, and that's probably what initially set me off on the task. So I think history and philosophy have been my two passions always. I mean, it wasn't always clear. All my philosophy books have a lot of history in them, right? So, and I could have gone the history route as well, but I ended up in the philosophy route. So I think that those are, in terms of my early life, how my father was a scientist, right? So he was a Harvard PhD, but he was a very open-minded scientist. Like he very much encouraged reading and learning and stuff like that. So.
Well, thank you so much for giving us those gifts at the end there. I think what's very interesting is to hear an argument and a presentation of conservatism from two individuals who are not purely American. And so it gives just a very interesting and fresh and dynamic perspective. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. I hope listeners will enjoy this as much as I have, but it's been a sincere pleasure.
Thank you very much. It was an honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. It is our sincere pleasure to bring you dynamic and provoking conversations like the one we had today. Make sure to share this episode with a friend or a foe, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.